Well, our immediate reaction is that it seems to us like a climb down from the position which the government adopted during the course of the general election, which was to introduce a blanket ban of smoking in enclosed public areas. And now they are introducing what appears to be an exemption in relation to a specific industry group, which is casinos. They adopted a purist position in relation to banning of smoking, and we actually had a different approach. We wanted a more staged approach, which would have probably led eventually to a smoking ban. We would have allowed, for example, smoking in restaurants and bars for a limited period of time, as happens in many other jurisdictions. Spain is an example of that. When Spain introduced their legislation in 2006, they did allow for smoking in restaurants and bars in areas so long as that they were contained and separately ventilated areas. And then they introduced the final ban in 2011, I think it was, or 2010, whilst the GSOP Liberal Party were very clear in their position that they would introduce a blanket ban across the board from day one. And that is the legislation, subject to some exemptions, that they introduced in October 2012. They now seem to be resiling from that, and we want a full explanation as to why that is the case.
Well, presumably the government will offer an explanation when the bill is debated in Parliament, so perhaps they might argue that you are jumping the gun by asking for it now.
Well, they're the ones who have introduced the bill. It was made public through the Gibraltar Gazette very recently. In fact, it was last week. And I think it's proper that we as an opposition party, we're here to question the government, not to sit on our laurels, but actually to bring to the public domain and public attention the fact that a new law is being introduced, which is a backtracking from the government's position of principle as adopted during the time of the last general election. And it is right and proper for us to do so now, and we call upon the government to offer an explanation before the debate in Parliament.
The way the legislation is worded, it tends to affect the casino or casinos, so would the opposition argue for it to be made available across the board on a level playing field?
Well, that actually raises a very interesting point. As I said earlier, our position was a more measured approach in relation to this. We acknowledge that a smoking ban was something which culturally was a radical shift of position. We didn't have any bans, obviously, before the law was introduced. We committed ourselves at the time of the last general election to introduce a smoking ban. We agreed there was sort of a cross-party position in relation to that. The only nuance between each of the parties, the only difference, is that we wanted a more staged approach. But the interesting point you raise is, well, what argument has been raised by this particular industry group which has led to the government changing its position, as I've said earlier, backtracking in relation to its point of principle? If the argument is, for example, loss of sales, then surely should the same not apply in relation to other license holders like restaurants and bars? And that is why we are calling on the government to explain why they are introducing this legislation and why they are backtracking from their original position.